Okay, what was going on last week?
We were discussing the priest's way of life being kept holy
Right?
and all the restrictions and qualifications and things they needed to avoid.
Right.
I'm being really vague, I could get in deeper, but.
Yeah, yeah. But that idea, all the troublemakers come in now. So last week there was this focus on the priest and the holiness of the priest. The priests are held to a higher standard. I'm just gonna hold on so you can hear it. The priests are held to a higher standard. Why?
Because they approach God,
Yes. And why does that make a difference?
they have to be holy as God is holy.
That's right. So one thing is it's dangerous to approach a holy God if you're not holy. And they are to teach the people how to be holy, and not only to teach the people, but also then to do ministry on behalf of the people. If they are not holy, how can they do their job? They can't, which has then implications for the whole nation. So the holiness of the priests is very important. They're set apart for this particular work, and they don't look to the nations around them to tell them what it means to be a priest of the Lord. If they look to the Egyptians or the Canaanites to tell them what it looks like to be a priest, they're going to be totally going in the wrong direction. The Lord makes it very clear this is what he wants for the priests who serve him. And, okay, what else do you remember from last week? Anything else?
It specified the qualifications of the wife they would take.
Yep. So it's not just the priest, it's his family that in a certain sense gets set apart, that is held to a higher standard. Yes? What else?
And the high priest was even held to a higher standard
Yes.
than the rest.
Mm-hmm. So you get the impression over and over the high priest is in a category all his own. Why would that be?
Well, he represents Christ.
That's right, because all of these things are pointing ahead to a spiritual reality, which is about Christ. Do you remember that list we saw of all the defects that would actually disqualify a man from offering things at the altar? And we talked about how that's not because God discriminates against people who are disabled. It's because wholeness is a metaphor for holiness. And who is it who's being represented by the priests? It's Christ. But ultimately, it's pointing ahead to the high priest to come, who is without blemish or spot.
Amen.
Yeah. Okay, anything else you want to mention from last week? Okay, Liz, you need questions? Pass those back to me. Okay, so we're carrying on with that theme of holiness today. So chapters 21, 22, and 23 are all unified by this focus on showing reverence for the Lord's holy things, his holy people, and his holy times. So we'll get to the holy times next week. We talked about the holy people last week. So today we're going to look at the sacrifices and the food portions of the sacrifices. Because they are given to the Lord and they're holy, the people have to be very careful about the way that they handle holy things, the things that belong to God. Because by showing reverence for the Lord's holy things, they're showing reverence for the Lord himself. That these are things that are set apart specifically for him. I can't remember if I used this illustration last week, but you know, if you have something that is set apart for a special use, what happens to it when you start using it just every day? So think about if you have certain dishes that you only use on certain occasions, or you have certain clothes that you only wear on a certain occasion, or if you have a certain pair of scissors that you only use to have fabric, right? As my mom would say, and my mom threatened me with near death if I used her fabric scissors for something else. Why?
Keep them sharp.
So if you start using them for something else,
It becomes dull.
they become dull, right?
They won't work for their given purpose.
That's right. And think about the same thing if you think about, dishes or clothes that you reserve for a certain occasion, if you start using those things all the time, it's okay to use them every day if you want, but at some point they start to lose their significance, right? They stop being special anymore because now they've become common. Now, there's a sense in which God is doing that sort of thing with all of these commands about setting stuff apart as holy. There are things that he does not want to be treated as common. He wants those things set apart for a special purpose, because when those things become common, they start to lose their meaning, right? You tend to devalue things when you use them as just something common instead of keeping them apart for a separate purpose. So in the same way that my mom would say the orange-handled scissors don't get used for anything but this, there's a sense in which the Lord is saying these things that belong to him, they have a very particular purpose, and the purpose starts to get lost if people just treat his holy things as if they're just common everyday stuff that doesn't matter.
It seems like for like a special meal, special tablecloth, special, china, special occasion, all of a sudden it captures you and you become more mindful of that moment in time. It seems like people are willing to be more present, so there's a deeper connection, or you just, whatever the purpose is, so it just, it is a foundation for a deeper experience of whatever is the focus.
Yes, and that's important when we look at the things like in this chapter, because through this experience, God is communicating very profound theological truths to his people. And they should be things that are memorable, where people go home and they remember what happened at the tabernacle, what they saw, what they experienced, how things happened there. They should be reflecting on those things in a way that leads them to spiritual truths. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at chapter 22. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron and his sons to treat with respect the sacred offerings the Israelites consecrate to me, so they will not profane my holy name. I am the Lord. Say to them, for the generations to come, if any of your descendants is ceremonially unclean and yet comes near the sacred offerings that the Israelites consecrate to the Lord, that person must be cut off from my presence. I am the Lord. If a descendant of Aaron has an infectious skin disease or a bodily discharge, he may not eat the sacred offerings until he is cleansed. He will also be unclean if he touches something defiled by a corpse or by anyone who has an emission of semen, or if he touches any crawling thing that makes him unclean, or any person who makes him unclean, whatever the uncleanness may be. The one who touches any such thing will be unclean till evening. He must not eat any of the sacred offerings unless he has bathed himself with water. When the sun goes down, he will be clean, and after that he may eat the sacred offerings, for they are his food. He must not eat anything found dead or torn by wild animals, and so become unclean through it. I am the Lord. The priests are to keep my requirements so that they do not become guilty and die for treating them with contempt. I am the Lord who makes them holy. No one outside a priest's family may eat the sacred offering, nor may the guest of a priest or his hired worker eat it. But if a priest buys a slave with money, or if a slave is born in his household, that slave may eat his food. If a priest's daughter marries anyone other than a priest, she may not eat any of the sacred contributions. But if a priest's daughter becomes a widow or is divorced yet has no children, and she returns to live in her father's house as in her youth, she may eat of her father's food. No unauthorized person, however, may eat any of it. If anyone eats a sacred offering by mistake, he must make restitution to the priest for the offering and add a fifth of the value to it. The priests must not desecrate the sacred offerings the Israelites present to the Lord by allowing them to eat the sacred offerings, and so bring upon them guilt requiring payment. I am the Lord who makes them holy. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the Israelites, and say to them, if any of you, either an Israelite or an alien living in Israel, presents a gift for a burnt offering to the Lord, either to fulfill a vow or as a freewill offering, you must present a male without defect from the cattle, sheep, or goats, in order that it may be accepted on your behalf. Do not bring anything with a defect, because it will not be accepted on your behalf. When anyone brings from the herd or flock a fellowship offering to the Lord to fulfill a special vow or as a freewill offering, it must be without defect or blemish to be acceptable. Do not offer to the Lord the blind, the injured, or the maimed, or anything with warts or festering or running sores. Do not place any of these on the altar as an offering made to the Lord by fire. You may, however, present as a freewill offering an ox or a sheep that is deformed or stunted, but it will not be accepted in fulfillment of a vow. You must not offer to the Lord an animal whose testicles are bruised, crushed, torn, or cut. You must not do this in your own land, and you must not accept such animals from the hand of a foreigner and offer them as the food of your God. They will not be accepted on your behalf because they are deformed and have defects. The Lord said to Moses, when a calf, a lamb, or a goat is born, it is to remain with its mother for 7 days. From the 8th day on, it will be acceptable as an offering made to the Lord by fire. Do not slaughter a cow or a sheep and its young on the same day. When you sacrifice a thank offering to the Lord, sacrifice it in such a way that it will be accepted on your behalf. It must be eaten that same day. Leave none of it till morning. I am the Lord. Keep my commands and follow them. I am the Lord. Do not profane my holy name. I must be acknowledged as holy by the Israelites. I am the Lord who makes you holy and who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord. Did you notice something that got repeated over and over and over?
I am the Lord.
Why do you think he keeps repeating that?
We need to hear it
Yeah, we need to hear it. Why?
and not forget.
Because he is the Lord.
We waver.
We do. And here's the thing, when he keeps repeating that, he's reminding them who their God is. Their God is not Chemosh, their God is not Molech, their God is not Baal, their God is the Lord. And because he's the Lord and he's their Lord, he has the sovereign authority to command them regarding these things, specifically about how to worship him. And he repeats it over and over and over because the need for repetition is part of the application, isn't it? Like we need it too. They have short memories and so do we. So this reminder of why do these things matter? Because the Lord is our God. He is the Lord. Okay, now how does the chapter begin in verses 1 and 2?
The Lord speaks to Moses and tells him to speak to Aaron and his sons.
So as we keep seeing over and over and over, the Lord doesn't say, okay, if you want to know how to treat the sacred offerings, look at the religions around you and just do what they do. The Lord is very particular about telling them this is what it looks like to worship him and this is how they have to treat the things that are brought to him. So specifically here, I mean, he's going to address all the Israelites, but right here he makes sure to tell Aaron and his sons, in particular the priests, to be respectful toward the sacred offerings that the people set aside for the Lord in order not to profane the holy name of God. So this is a summary statement. Verse 2 is a summary statement about all the instructions in this chapter. Everything in this chapter is about how to respect the Lord by respecting the sacred or the consecrated offerings that are brought to him. Now, what are those sacred offerings? Well, they would be the various food items that are given to the Lord, and they're considered sacred because when they're given to him, now they're holy. They're set apart. And that would include portions of the grain offering, the fellowship offering, the sin offering, the guilt offering, the first fruits also of oil and wine and grain. And the Lord takes those things and gives them then to the priests and their household as provision for them. So these things, because they've been given to the Lord, they have to be handled in a very particular way. Okay, now what are the instructions then? Okay, so there's a summary statement. Now we get into the details. What are the instructions the Lord then gives them in verse 3?
While they're unclean, if he has uncleanness, that person shall be cut off from the Lord's presence.
Is it being unclean that gets them cut off? What are they doing that while they're unclean? That's the problem
Going near
here.
the holy thing.
Right. So it's not just being ceremonially unclean, it's that if a priest who is ceremonially unclean then approaches the altar or brings the offerings of the people to the Lord, he has to be cut off from the presence of God.
So God is gracious. He tells us, he wants us to come to him, but he tells us there's the right way to come.
That's right.
And approach me.
Yes, that's right. And because of the particular role the priests have, they have to be very mindful of this. I mean, the Israelites do, but the priests in particular have to be very mindful about it. Now, the implication here is that this is an unintentional, this is intentional. So the reason we know that is because we've already had instructions earlier in Leviticus about what to do if you are unclean, you realize it later, it was unintentional, there's a way to deal with that. So if there's cutting off that happens, the implication is this is an intentional sin. That is that the priest knows he's unclean and he doesn't deal with it. And so then the penalty is that he's cut off from the Lord's presence. This is serious. I mean, the thing is, if the priests are doing that kind of thing, it's not like the people could necessarily do anything about it, right? I mean, you can't impeach the priest. You can't vote him out. The only person who can do something about that is the Lord, but the Lord will do it. He will cut off a priest or a high priest who profanes his name like this. Can you think of an example?
Eli's son.
Yep, Eli and his sons, right? Because the sons are the ones profaning the name of the Lord, but because Eli is the high priest, they all get held responsible for that, Eli in particular. And if you've read that section, do you know how cut off does his family become?
i.e. dead.
They're dead, and not only do they all die, but their family gets cut off from the priesthood permanently. Nobody else in their family line then can serve as a priest. So the Lord's serious when he says this, that the priests have to treat his things with respect, to not intentionally approach the Lord in a way that's ritually impure. Okay, now carrying on with that, what does he add in verses 4 to 8?
If you're unclean, you can't eat the holy offerings until you are clean.
Mm-hmm. So we had all this instruction about ritual purity, spreading diseases, bodily discharges, touching something dead or unclean, touching an unclean animal. All that was applied to the people generally in the chapters we saw before. Now it gets applied to the priests specifically, and that it's not just that they can't offer the offerings if they're ritually impure, it's that they can't eat from those offerings either. So for a major ritual impurity like a spreading disease or an abnormal discharge, the priest is not allowed to eat from any of the sacred offerings until he's healed and cleansed. For a minor ritual impurity, he washes himself, he waits till evening, then he'll be clean, and then he's allowed to eat the sacred offerings. And of course, all this is important because the sacred offerings are the regular provision for the priests. And not only that, the priests are not to eat roadkill. It's not really roadkill, but you know what I mean. Why not?
Bacteria, viruses, all kinds of good.
Yeah, so there's bacteria, viruses, all that health and medical stuff, but what else?
It's dead, it's unclean.
And why does that matter?
Because it's unclean.
That's right. So if the priest touches something that's already dead, he becomes ritually impure. And if he becomes ritually impure, he can't do his job, right? So it might be hard to let meat go to waste, you know, in a culture where people don't eat meat for breakfast, lunch, and supper the way that we do. But for a priest, he has to prioritize his job over the meat, basically. If he goes out and finds his cow has died, he's not to touch it because touching the carcass of a cow will make him ritually impure. So his job has to take priority over that.
Can someone else in Israel feed him?
What do you mean by that?
He's not to eat of the holy offerings? Can he eat ones that weren't offered? I mean, can you go to the store and buy some?
Hold that thought. Okay, just hold that thought for a minute. Okay, because we're going to get to something in a minute about, okay, so what do you do if you're ritually unclean? Does that mean you just fast until you're clean again? Well, it can't be that, because if you have a spreading disease and you have it for a long time, then what are you going to eat? Right? Okay, we'll come back to that in just a minute.
This makes me think of the original comment in Genesis. The general message that I'm getting as I read these verses is that sin is very destructive, and you can't get anywhere close to it without becoming a part of it.
Yes.
And the other thing that God said, you know, in the day that you eat thereof, you will die. the Hebrew is dying, you will die. Disease is a part of death, and I'm speaking as a nurse. And so the metaphor is really about sin.
Yeah, it's physical things that point to a spiritual reality, definitely. Yep. Okay, now, before he goes on, there's a really interesting addition that he puts in verse 9. What does he say to the priests in verse 9?
The priest must keep a requirement until they do not become guilty and die.
And die. It's a very pointed warning to the priests right before addressing then his family, which is coming next. So the men who serve as priests have to make sure they do their work in a way that doesn't bring guilt onto them. If they treat the offerings with contempt, they will die. This is a serious business, partly because the Lord is worthy of an appropriate fear, and partly because the priests and the offerings all point ahead to Christ. And so for the priest to treat the offerings with contempt is to thoroughly misrepresent the picture of Christ that God is communicating through these things. And the Lord will not put up with that, at least not indefinitely. They might not fully understand what's coming later, but he will not allow the priests, even inadvertently, to disrespect the symbols of the Son that way. And so, again, he's the Lord who makes the priests holy. He's the one who sets them apart for himself. That gives him the sovereign authority to set the standard by which they go about their work. Now, I don't know that the priests would have just been blatantly, disdainful or scornful in the way they handled the Lord's offerings, but what does it look like to treat the Lord's offerings with contempt? Well, we mentioned already Eli and his sons. That's a pretty obvious one. This also comes up in the book of Malachi. In Malachi chapter 1, the Lord, he gives the priests the what for, because they are acting like their job is a burden. They're kind of tired of doing their work, and they're not really into it. And so they're just sort of haphazard about the commands of the Lord. They let the people bring offerings that they shouldn't be bringing, and the priests just kind of let them do what they want. And the Lord really lays into the priests about that they are not to be doing this work in a way that they're just treating the holy things of his dwelling place as if it's common, as if that stuff is just common. It isn't. It's holy, and it matters how the priests deal with it. Okay, now in verse 10, we're going to start expanding on the previous instruction. So what does he add in verses 10 to 13?
He specifies who can eat the holy offering. It's for the priests and his family.
Right. So no one outside of the priest's family is allowed to eat the offerings, whether it's a guest or a hired worker, whoever it is. So that means if the priest invites his neighbors over for dinner, he has to feed them something that does not come from an offering at the tabernacle. However, a slave or a servant who's a permanent member of the household, they're allowed to eat from the offerings because this is the provision for the household. If a priest's daughter gets married, leaves the house, okay, now she's part of another household, but if she comes back later to live with him because she's widowed or divorced and has no children, now she's part of his household again, and so she's allowed to eat from the offerings. But no unauthorized person is allowed to do that. Unauthorized being no one outside of the priest's family or household.
If they have some left, do they have to burn it? It doesn't say, but...
Yes, that's from the previous instructions about how to deal with the sacrifices. If there's food left over, yes, they burn it.
And why does it specify the priest's daughter not having a child and coming back?
I wanted to know.
Because then she would be part of a different household. The implication being if she's widowed, but she has children, her children would take care of her.
Oh,
So she would be part of that household. They would be responsible for her provision, not her father, who's the priest.
but what if they were little tiny children? Is it because they won't
Well,
grow up to be a priest because they're from a different household?
well, the idea is that she's dependent on the provision of whatever household she belongs to.
Oh, okay. So the
So-
extended family would take care of her.
If she's living with extended family, then she's
Yeah.
not allowed to eat the priest's food.
Yeah.
So
The husband's family has more of a responsibility to her because
Because
Even
of the
if she's
children?
divorced? No, they wouldn't
Do they
take
say
care of her.
divorce?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, basically, any situation where she's part of a different household, her provision comes through that household. She's not allowed to eat the provisions for the priest. But if, because of her situation, whatever that is, she has to move back in with her father, and now she's living in her father's household, now she's allowed to eat the provisions of the priest, because that's the household she belongs to.
Could she still move in with her child and be fed from different food?
Well, I would assume that if her children are young enough that I mean, if they're not old enough to support her, she could move back in with her young children, and they would all be provided for. But the implication is, if she has grown children,
Yeah.
she's not going to be living with her father, she's going to be living with her children, or they're going to be the ones at least who are providing for her. Yeah. Okay, now back to this question you asked earlier, what does all that mean for people in the family who are unclean? Or for neighbors who are invited over for dinner? I mean, if you invite somebody over to dinner and you're a priest, you can't feed them the food from those offerings. Now, Numbers 18 adds some details that are related to all this. And I haven't studied Numbers 18 in depth, but it seems to me, when I read it, like the offerings that are brought to be sacrificed on the altar are treated differently from the tithes of the people, which are the Lord's provision not just for the priests, but for all of the Levites. So, I'm not positive, but my impression is that the food that comes from a sacrifice can only be eaten by someone who's ceremonially clean, and even then it depends on what type of sacrifice it is. But that food that comes from the tithes can be eaten by anybody who's a Levite, whether they're ceremonially clean or unclean. So if you're unclean, if you're a priest who's unclean and you're not allowed to eat the sacred offerings, you could still get your provision from the tithes that the people bring.
So Kelly, the priest could go to the Levite grocery store.
I'm hungry. Don't touch me though.
Yeah, remember, the Levites are set apart, and they don't have land, and so they're dependent on
The
these tithes, and, yeah.
Because they're singers and doormen and
Yeah.
all kinds of things.
Pole carriers.
Yeah.
Carriers.
Now, it could be that someone who is not authorized to eat the sacred offering does so by mistake. So say you have a priest who takes home some bread portions of a fellowship offering, gives them to his wife for supper. She puts them out on the counter, and then her teenage son comes in with his friend, and they eat everything in sight. I only say that because Lindsay brings that up a lot. Right? They clear out the fridge and they eat it all. So you have a guest in the house who just helps themselves to that bread without knowing where it came from. Now, in that case, what happens in 14 to 16?
You have to make up for it.
The person who ate it, who was not authorized to eat it, has to make restitution. They have to make restitution to the priest for what they ate and add a fifth onto the value. Why? Because this isn't just any bread. It's a sacred offering that an Israelite presented to the Lord. The Lord gave it to the priest for himself and his family. It's holy, and it has to be treated differently from regular bread. It has to be treated with respect because it belongs to the Lord. Even if it's unintentional, it still has to be dealt with. And it's interesting then that what he adds next to the priests. What does he say to the priests in 15 and 16?
Priest must not desecrate sacred offerings the Israelites present to the Lord.
Keep going.
By allowing them to eat the sacred offerings and so bring upon them guilt requiring repayment.
So right here, the Lord is saying, okay, someone comes into your house and they eat something that's sacred without knowing it, but the priests, to a certain extent, are on the hook to keep that from happening. So the priest himself has to be mindful of this to protect both the offerings and the other Israelites by keeping secure, in a certain sense, keeping separate food that other people are not allowed to eat, so that that doesn't happen, so that someone doesn't come into his house and mistakenly eat something they're not supposed to eat. Because if they do, if they come in and do that, even unintentionally, they become guilty of a sin against the Lord's holy things. So it's like the Lord saying to the priests, keep the sacred bread somewhere else, or make sure that you're not giving to other people something that's holy and they don't know it, because then they're the ones who are guilty. But you need to be the one who protects them. And then again, the Lord adds that statement of authority in verse 16. He's the Lord who makes the high priest holy. The high priest and all the priests. Okay, now, then we continue that theme of how to handle the Lord's holy things, but now with a focus on the animals that are brought as a voluntary offering to the Lord by a worshiper. So, if somebody brings a voluntary offering, and what I mean by a voluntary offering is the sin offering or purification offering and the guilt offering, those are not voluntary offerings. Those are offerings that you are required to bring in order to deal with sin. But there are other offerings that are voluntary. You can bring them when you want. For various worship reasons, you might bring these offerings, and for a voluntary offering by the worshiper, either to fulfill a vow or as a free will offering, there are two options for that. One is a burnt offering, and the other is a fellowship offering. So, verses 17 to 20 give us instructions for someone who brings a voluntary burnt offering. What are the requirements if you're going to bring this offering to the Lord?
It needs to be of your own free will.
Mm-hmm. What else?
Without blemish.
Mm-hmm. Male?
And a stranger can do it.
Say that again, Kelly.
A stranger can offer.
As in a foreigner who resides in Israel, right?
Someone
So-
that has become Jewish.
Or somebody who's living in Israel. So the assumption being that this is somebody who's moved into Israel and now they worship the Lord. So if they, think Ruth, for example. So that person also can bring this kind of offering to the Lord. So the animal that's brought has to be a male, without defect, from the cattle, sheep, or goats, in order to be acceptable to the Lord. Now, we know too, birds would also be accepted. We know that from a previous chapter. But they're not mentioned here, I think, because there's not a lot of variation in the value of pigeons or doves like there would be for livestock. The value matters because a burnt offering is the costliest of all the sacrifices. That picture of atonement and devotion that's communicated by the entire animal being burned up, that's really important. And so this is the costliest offering there is. And for this offering, the worshiper must not bring any animal with any kind of defect. If they do, it won't be accepted by the Lord. Okay, now verses 21 to 25 provide instructions for someone who brings a voluntary offering, but instead of it being a burnt offering, it's a fellowship or a peace offering, and they bring it to fulfill a special vow or just as a free will kind of offering. Now, what are the requirements for this one?
Without defect or blemish.
Yes. Did you notice it can be a female? Because he doesn't specify it has to be male. That lines up with things we've seen before, that for these kinds of offerings you can bring a male or a female animal, because the value is not necessarily as costly as a burnt offering is. What else?
You can have a leg too long or too short.
That's right. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it is.
But it's specifically for the free will offering and not for a vow. That's very interesting. Okay, so we'll come back to that in just a second. But the obvious question then, when he says it has to be without defect or blemish, what qualifies as a defect or blemish? Well, what does he list right here?
Blind, broken, maimed,
Mhm.
ulcerous,
Yep.
scabs,
Yes. None of those animals can be placed on the altar as an offering to the Lord.
or warts.
Yes, all that makes it disqualified. The exception being an ox or sheep that has a leg too long or too short. Now, that didn't apply for offerings that are used to fulfill a vow, probably because public expressions of thanksgiving to the Lord for something he had done require a slightly more expensive offering. A free will offering seems to be just a catch-all for any kind of reason that someone would want to come and praise the Lord, and to do it in a way where you're sitting down with other people and celebrating a meal. And so a free will fellowship offering, in a certain sense, it's slightly cheaper because the significance is not quite as weighty. But that doesn't mean that you can bring whatever, because of course, what's offered to the Lord, the fat, is still unaffected by this. And the standard is only slightly lower because all of the other things, all of the other types of blemishes are still things that make the animal unacceptable.
So is it, oh, I'm sorry. You go ahead.
Does it make a difference that the burnt offering, it said no defect, and the free will offering, it says defect or blemish? I mean, why did they add the blemish?
I don't know. I don't know that it's, I think it's two words for the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah. But, yeah.
Okay.
Sally, has it ever talked about the limbs anywhere else?
Not that I know of, but I haven't looked.
Yeah.
I haven't noticed anywhere else in Leviticus.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't know animals were born like that.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, now, yeah, I heard somebody
Sally
inhale.
had sometimes said that an offering might be for a whole family
Mhm.
instead of just a person. If everybody brought a bull, we would have, in the family, they would have a whole lot of meat.
Right.
So maybe one big offering would be for the whole family.
Yes. Yeah. And that list then of the blemishes or defects, it continues in verse 24, specifically saying that a male animal that's brought as an offering must not be castrated. When the people settle in the land of Canaan, they must not bring castrated animals as offerings to the Lord. If they buy or they're given that kind of animal from a foreigner, they can use it for other things, but they cannot offer it to the Lord because those kinds of offerings are not accepted by him. Okay, now, there's something significant to note right here, which is that this list parallels the list concerning the priests last week in chapter 21. So what I mean by that is 5 of those terms overlap in Hebrew, as in the same requirements for the animals as there were for the priests. The priests too could not be blind or deformed or crippled or have festering sores, all that kind of thing. Each of the lists contains 12 blemishes, beginning with blindness and ending with damaged testicles. Why would that be? Well, at the least, those parallels underscore that whatever approaches the altar must be without defect or blemish, whether it's a priest or whether it's the sacrifice that goes on it. Why would you have the same list for both?
You want to be holy. You want to be as pure as you can.
Mm-hmm. Who does the priest point to?
Christ.
And who does the sacrifice point to?
Christ.
Christ. And because both the sacrifice and the priest are pointing ahead to a priest and sacrifice coming who is without defect or blemish in the sense that he's blameless. There's again this physical metaphor of a sacrifice and a priest coming who's going to be perfect. And so it matters that both the priest and the sacrifice are blameless in a certain sense.
Sally, I've asked before, but were the priests aware that this was pointing to the Messiah?
I don't know how much they understood. I know that they, well, we're going to do Psalm 51 when we get to the end of Leviticus. And it's very interesting when you read Psalm 51 to see how much David understood about how the things of the sacrificial system were not an end in themselves. They were pointing to something else. But how much he understood as far as did he know that God himself would become the sacrifice? I don't know. I don't know how much, I don't know. I don't know. I know that anybody whose faith was in God, who was thinking about those things, knew there had to be a better sacrifice coming. There had to be a final sacrifice coming. But how much they understood about what that would look like, I don't know. I mean, you read Isaiah 53, and you get the sense, I mean, he's using sacrificial terms to refer to the Messiah. But again, I mean, how much people thought that out or understood the implications of that, I don't know.
That's an interesting question. I'm thinking that probably Abraham, Moses, they could grasp that, but how much is transferred? Because I think of the conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus,
Mhm.
and he said, how is it that you are,
You're not
you're
getting this.
saying you don't
That's
know
right.
these things?
That's
Meaning, the implication is the information was given, maybe required some meditation, and if it got lost, then that was a deficiency on their part, so
Right, there was enough information in the Old Testament
if they wanted to see it,
for people to realize.
what it was
Yes.
about.
Yeah. It's interesting when you mention Abraham. I was thinking about him in relation to some of these things, because when you think about the story with Abraham and Isaac, where, you know, he's going to sacrifice Isaac, and then the Lord provides a ram in Isaac's place. And why does he do that? Because when you know the end of the story, you know the substitute is pointing ahead to something else. What's really interesting is that then Abraham names that place, the Lord will provide. And I find it interesting that he doesn't name the place, the Lord has provided. He names it, the Lord will provide, which, by the way, is Mount Moriah, which is where the temple ends up being built. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
And so this idea of here's Abraham, who I don't think he understands that God is going to become a descendant in his line, you know, that he's going to insert himself into the line of Abraham, and he's going to do, I don't know how much of that Abraham understood, but the fact that he sees this and realizes the Lord will provide the substitute. There's something in that that expresses a faith of saying, okay, the Lord has promised something coming in the future, and I'm going to trust him for it. Yeah, and you're right, then there's enough information to trust the Lord for that, and yet you get to the New Testament and you see a lot of people who should have at least said, okay, something's going on right here that's been promised in all of these things, and a whole lot of the teachers aren't getting it. They're not understanding how Jesus fulfills those things.
That's why God has to keep saying, I am the Lord who sanctifies them.
Yeah. Okay, now, in addition to which animals can or can't be brought, there are also some procedures that people have to follow. And he mentions that in 26 to 28. So a newborn animal cannot be brought as an offering until it is at least a week old. I don't know if that coincides with, you know, circumcision, which also happens on the 8th day. If there's this idea that, you know, you belong to the Lord starting on the 8th day. I don't know, but it's an interesting coincidence. And also, a mother animal and its baby are not to be slaughtered on the same day. Now, the rationale for this is not laid out anywhere in the law. A lot of the commentators think that there's probably something going on in the pagan rituals that the Lord is prohibiting right here, because there were all kinds of sort of superstitious fertility rites that the people of Canaan practiced in order to try to get their flocks and herds to grow bigger, to get their fields to produce more. That kind of stuff shows up throughout the Old Testament. And so it might be that there's something right here the Canaanites were doing that the Israelites would have known, and the Lord says don't be doing that kind of thing. Or it might be that the Lord is putting a sort of limit right here that forces the people to be mindful of what they're killing and why they're killing it, in the sense that you don't just wantonly destroy God's creation. You don't just kill things because you can kill them. There's a purpose in doing these things where the Lord is very particular. Okay, take life seriously. It is, the animals are used for food, they're used for atonement, but they are not just to be destroyed because you can do it. Now the reason I mention that is because there's actually a couple of things in Deuteronomy 20 and 22, where the Lord says, for example, if you take the eggs from a nest, or I think maybe it's the other way around, maybe you take the eggs, but you have to leave the mother bird, or it might be you can take the mother bird, but you have to leave the eggs, I can't remember which it is, but you can't take it all. That idea, like, you don't need to just take everything because it's there. Take what you need, but leave the life that you don't need. He actually says something similar about the trees. He gets very angry when the Babylonians and the Assyrians just come and clear all these forests out just because they can. Just because it's war and they want to do what they're going to do. That kind of just destruction of the Lord's creation is something that he does not take lightly. And so it might be that there's something here where the Lord's just saying, okay, if you're going to kill something, be mindful of why you're doing it. Don't just kill things to be killing. Now, I don't know, I'm not going to go out on a limb about either one of those things, but it seems to me that both of those things are trying to communicate to the people of Israel, life is important. Don't take it for granted. Use it for the things that the Lord has given, the purposes that the Lord has for it. And don't follow the things that the Canaanites are doing. Okay, however it is that the Canaanites treat animals and stuff, you take your cues from the Lord, not from the way the Canaanites do it.
Your point is well taken about it's a compassion piece.
Mm-hmm.
So what I've read about some of their pagan rituals, they're designed to create unnatural affection, maybe a disconnect from having any compassion for life.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And you see that in gangs today. So there's a progression of what you have to do in order to prove that that you'll do anything. But in order to do these things, there's a severing, as we see in the New Testament,
Mm-hmm.
where it says your conscience is seared.
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciate this, what you said, is that God is saying, I am a God of love and compassion, and He's put parameters here so that we're not severing those, that natural tendency.
Yeah, in a sense that you can become very desensitized to
Correct.
killing things.
Correct.
Right? And God does not intend for his people to become desensitized to
Exactly.
just taking life just because you can. Yeah.
He would sure cut off poachers.
Yeah.
Suppose it depends on how hungry you are.
I read a pamphlet one time years ago by a Jewish guy named Zola Levitt, who supposedly wrote this piece in conjunction with a gynecologist. And it was called The Seven Feasts of Israel, and it likened all of the stages of pregnancy to all the feasts in Israel, the seven feasts. Different feasts commemorated different stages in that pregnancy. And this time going back to this 8th day thing, and I just Googled it. The medical considerations are that vitamin K levels, which play a role in blood clotting, are at the peak on the 8th day, making circumcision a safer procedure, but, maybe, so you leave the lamb with its mother for 8 days, I don't.
Maybe there's some symbolism with the passing of 7 days
Yeah,
beforehand.
well, and there's
I'm not sure.
7 too.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
And the bottom line is God says so.
Yeah.
And I suspect the Israelites would have understood why this
Yeah.
matters.
Yeah, they have.
Okay, now what does he add in 29 and 30 about sacrifices?
And shall leave none of it until the morning.
Right. And it concentrates right here on a praise or a thank offering. Maybe because the focus of these chapters is on treating the Lord's holy things with respect, and this is the holiest of the fellowship or the peace offerings. This is a type of peace or fellowship offering that you use for a particular purpose of praise. Now there were instructions about this back in chapter 7, and right here the Lord just reiterates that the meat of the praise or the thank offering has to be eaten the same day or it will not be accepted on the worshiper's behalf. Why does that matter? Why does it matter that you don't leave it till tomorrow?
By then, that time it becomes impure.
That's right. And it's, for other offerings, it's possible to eat it, maybe the next day or the day after that. But the Lord is very particular that it has to be eaten within a particular period of time, because it's not supposed to be treated the way your backyard barbecue is treated. You can't take the meat of an offering, which again represents who? Christ. Like all of this is pointing ahead to Christ, right? You can't take an offering that's intended to point to Christ, take the meat of that offering and treat it just the way you treat any other meat. As in, you leave it in your, I know they don't have fridges, but you leave it in your fridge and then at one point you realize, oh, it's gone bad, and then you throw it out. Think about the weight of what's being communicated by that, if the meat that you're eating represents the sacrifice who's coming. And your thanksgiving to the Lord. That's right. You don't want that meat going bad. You don't want it becoming impure. And so the Lord's very particular. Okay, this is special meat for a special purpose. So treat it like the special thing that it is. Don't treat it like it's common. Treat it differently from the way you treat regular meat. Okay, how does the chapter end? In 31 to 33.
Keep my commands and follow them.
Mm-hmm. Keep going.
Do not profane my holy name.
Yep. Keep going.
I am the Lord who made you holy,
Mm-hmm.
and who brought you out of Egypt to be your God.
Yes.
I am the Lord.
So these last verses, they're like an exclamation point on the whole of chapters 21 and 22.
Yes.
The Lord's people are to keep his commands and follow him, to not defile his name, because he must be treated as holy by his people. Why? Because he's the Lord who made them holy, and because he delivered them out of Egypt to be their God. Why do you think he threw that bit in about Egypt right there?
Reminder
Of what?
of their freedom from slavery,
Mm-hmm.
being set free.
Yeah. And when he freed them from slavery, did he bring them out of Egypt into the wilderness and then say, okay, my work here is done.
Nope.
Okay, camp out time, have fun.
Sandals were not wearing out, and food was being provided for them. And
Yep. He didn't bring them out of Egypt so
be
they could do their own
Egyptians.
thing, so they could be Egyptians living in the wilderness,
Yeah.
right? He brought them out of Egypt to be his people. The whole purpose of bringing them out of bondage and slavery was so that they would belong to him. And so here's a whole chapter on what it looks like to worship him rightly because they belong to him. If they are his, which is the same thing as being holy, holy means belonging to the Lord. If he's holy and he's set them apart for himself, then how they worship matters, because they treat him differently from the way the Egyptians treat their gods or the way the Canaanites treat their gods. So 3 times in those verses he reiterates, he is the Lord. And back to what we said at the beginning, to treat something as common, it devalues or it diminishes its importance and its weight. And so here's the Lord working into just the everyday lives of the Israelites, reminders, and the priests in particular, reminders that there are certain things that cannot be made common, because if you make them common, you devalue those things, and it affects your relationship with the Lord. Because now you're losing the meaning that's being communicated by those special things that are set apart to teach the people who the Lord is, how they relate to him, and to point ahead to the Messiah. Okay, now why do those things matter to us? I mean, we're not under this covenant anymore, so why does it matter to us?
We just always need to remind ourselves of who the Lord is, and how we need to respect him and love him
Mm-hmm. Yep,
and approach him.
that's right. How we approach him. That's an interesting thing that I've been thinking a lot since we've been studying Leviticus, is we have a big emphasis, I think, in our culture on the fact that God is your friend, which isn't wrong, but I think sometimes we come to that with a sort of idea like you can be sort of flippant and casual and haphazard in the way that you approach God, and Leviticus just says over and over, remember who your God is. He's holy. He's holy. He's the Almighty. He's dangerous.
He's not just your pal or your friend.
He's not.
He's your leader, your teacher, your
That's right.
judge.
Mhm.
This
Good.
verse in 32 is interesting. It says, you shall not profane my holy name. We usually think of cursing, but the following sentences, I will be hallowed among the children of Israel, meaning if we take the name of the Lord God our behavior, what we do, is representing who we serve.
Right.
And God is very jealous about that representation
Mhm.
because we are priests. And so how there was a passage here that, you know, where you unintentionally eat offering and then you make restitution and you add 1/5 to it. God is saying that if you do wrong to someone else, you're misrepresenting me, and you need to turn back around and make restitution, either in a conversation or monetary or, you know. So that's what you see that throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yep. This principle of how holiness affects the whole of life.
And how often do we
Yeah.
hear people say, Christians are the worst, because they're not taking this seriously. They're not, if I profess, then God is asking me to examine myself.
Anything else you want to add? There's a bit in 1 Timothy that makes me think he had Leviticus in the back of his mind. Not 1 Timothy, sorry, 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 1. I'm going to read in 1 Peter 1, starting in verse 13. Therefore, prepare your minds for action, be self-controlled, set your hope fully on the grace to be given you when Jesus Christ is revealed. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance, but just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, be holy, because I am holy. You know where that comes from? He's quoting Leviticus, right? Since you call on a Father who judges each man's work impartially, live your lives as strangers here in reverent fear. For you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your forefathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. Through him you believe in God, who raised him from the dead and glorified him, and so your faith and hope are in him. Now that you have purified yourselves by obeying the truth, so that you have sincere love for your brothers, love one another deeply from the heart. It's very interesting, that whole idea, like, okay, if Jesus is the final sacrifice, and you belong to God because of what Christ has done for you, now what does that look like for the whole of your life? It looks like holiness. And what does it look like to pursue holiness? It's not ritual purity that's in focus. What Peter says is, it's your character. It's how you live, and if you live in a way that reflects the character of the God that you belong to. So make your redemption known by pursuing holiness in all the big and small things of life. And we don't do it in order to get accepted by God. We do it because we're already accepted by God. So we're not pursuing holiness to get God's favor. We're pursuing holiness because we already have it.
Well, so this whole chapter, when God said a couple of times, I sanctify you, meaning I'm the change agent.
Right.
You don't come to me and have a relationship with me that's authentic without being changed by my presence.
Yeah.
And so that's the acid test. Mm-hmm. Do we see, as, are there fruits in the life?
Right. All right. Any last comments? Anything you want to add?
This is good. This is
All right.
really good. This is a very good chapter.
Yeah.